So, good morning, everybody. It's my great pleasure to be here with you this morning. And what I'd like to do is to think about the role that sustainable supply chains can play and the role of digital technologies in supporting those sustainable supply chains. And just as we saw in the introduction, I think one of the great things about this area, my expertise is in supply chains, not steel. Actually, through my time at WMG, I was brought into the wonderful world of steel, and actually it brings together a number of different projects. I'm also the co-director of the Made Smarter Social Science Network, which is called Interact, which works alongside the EPSRC research centres that were aforementioned. And I think what this shows is it's not just the technology, but it's the way that we use the technology that's really going to help to make the difference. And Joanna Lumley said something much more recently ahead of COP26 on a similar theme, but it was last year in about October 2020 that Sir David Attenborough launched a series of podcasts. And what he was essentially saying that in order to save nature, we need to curb excess capitalism. And fundamentally, what he was saying is that our sort of consumption-driven approaches to capitalism, the way in which large multinational organizations make money by selling more, and we as consumers help to fuel that by buying more, is great for economic development, but is really beginning to harm our planet. And actually, it also leads to quite a lot of exploitation of people within our supply chains. And so if we think about United Nations Sustainability Development Goal number 12, this actually calls for much more responsible consumption and production. And for me, responsibility is at the heart of sustainability. And essentially what we need to enable businesses to do, and you saw earlier Anna mentioned towards metal as a service, we actually need to think about how do we enable our businesses to thrive so that we economically continue to develop as a world and ensure that everybody has access to the resources that they need, but at the same time do so in a way that better protects our planet and ensures a fairer return to those in our supply chains. And to do this, we really need to think about new business models that will support more responsible models of both consumption and production. And fundamental to this, and it was great at COP26, but COP26 talks very much focuses on one aspect of how we can achieve net zero, which is through industrial decarbonisation. And actually, if you look at a lot of what came out of the steel plan coming out of COP26, much of the short-term ambition was around decarbonisation, and that is a very important aspect. But if we just continue to do what we do in a more decarbonised way, we won't achieve net zero by 2050. We also have to think about that dimension, which is about the circular economy and how we can actually keep products in their highest possible value state for as long as possible, so that recycling is actually a path that we only take when we have no other option. So what we did a couple of years back, it's actually in 2020, so just a year ago, when I was still at WMG, sponsored by a company called Blue Yonder, we did a major systematic literature review of all of the sources, both government reports, consultancy reports, and academic literature, to look at circular economy practices within supply chain and what these could mean going forward. And what we then used that literature review to do, it started with over 600,000 different data sources, and we narrowed it down to the sort of 108 key sources, was that we developed some scenarios. Now, there's different approaches to scenarios, and we took the view where we looked at the two polar extremes, neither of which are likely to exist in reality, you hope. What we hope is that the reality we create is somewhere in between. But depending on the actions that we take will depend on whether we're closer to that flourishing world or actually remain in a slightly dystopian world on an edge. Because if we keep doing what we're currently doing, if we keep pursuing a more linear approach to our economy, if as businesses we pursue this approach to economic growth that's based on overconsumption, we will create intense competition. And it's sort of what you can currently start to see. We start to see global trade being reduced and fragmented. Just think of some of the tariffs that Trump put in terms of steel a couple of years back. We'll start to see a deterioration in the quality of life because that gap between the rich and the poor gets bigger. And we'll actually see that between city and rural life too. We'll see ever more complicated customs procedures, something that we're very much enjoying, even if you're just ordering a Christmas present from Europe at the moment. Don't order anything that's over £125 because you'll get walloped with a great big tariff. But also we'll start to see the increasing disparity between large companies and SMEs. And if you think about the UK, 99% of our manufacturing organisations are SMEs. But we'll also see that innovation becomes much more inhibited to those large organisations. And the world won't be particularly pleasant. And we'll move further away from those goals because we won't transition to low carbon energy in the way that we'd hoped, and fossil fuels will remain dominant. And that will be both in terms of how we power industry, our homes, and our mobility. And our manufacturing supply chains will still be very linear. And because they are so much pushed to the edge around profitability and fighting other threats such as cybersecurity, the net zero agenda will be pushed back. And what we'll start to see is a reduction across low and semi-skilled jobs, increasing unemployment rates. However, we have a huge part to play in creating a slightly different world, a world that is flourishing, and a world that is taking us much more quickly towards that net zero 2050 target. And this is because sustainability and circular economy practices are at the core, and critical to that is the integration of advanced technology, or what I would call, and the Made Smarter initiative calls, industrial digital technologies, or IDTs. But this has to be supported by altered consumption models, which is why it's so important for us to work with those social sciences, or those softer elements of this as well. It's not just about technology. And we finally need to actually work together and to collaborate and not play lip service to that, because this will enable us to create much more of a single global market, and we will have sufficient raw materials and resources because we're quite happy to mine what's already in circulation. Interestingly, though, there could be a diminished trade flow of finished goods, and that's because we're competing much more on sustainability within a regional level. So there's a much higher degree of regional self-reliance. And this is great news for our manufacturing firms because their shift to new business models has enabled them to enjoy increased profitability as they focus much more on customer value creation, which enables them to benefit from better cost structures and productivity gains. And from an energy perspective, we've made that shift to industrial decarbonisation, again, in terms of our industry, homes and mobility. And this more regional approach to manufacturing has been developed both across the UK and Europe. And we are leveraging these closed loop models to avoid risks from resource and price fluctuations. And it's hugely enabled by digital transparency and supported by things like intelligent manufacturing, AI, circular economy business models, but very, very much driven by those customer needs. And the exciting thing is that this is leading to new jobs, not just in those forward-facing manufacturing processes. You know, in a way, maybe the UK will never make anything from scratch ever again, but perhaps what we'll be expert at is that recycling, the reverse logistics, and those secondary markets of upgrade, repair, and remanufacturing. And this will require an investment in circular economy practices, this real focus on actually thinking about those other loops, not just that primary linear manufacturing route, and actually realizing the value of product throughout its life. And what we were able to do is to, from that review, is to identify 54 critical drivers. And then what we did was to cluster those into the two major drivers. And not surprisingly, the adoption of industrial digital technologies was one of those core drivers. And I could argue I'm slightly biased, but I was so pleased, but I could totally understand why. The other key driver was integration with supply chain partners. You cannot do this alone. In order for this to work, even within your own, many steel companies are relatively vertically integrated, but you can still operate your businesses with each stage in that steel process being an island of its own productivity, rather than actually thinking of your business as an end-to-end supply chain. And I see this a lot in the work that I've done with the steel industry over the last 8 years, where other industries take and consumer packaged goods, fast-moving consumer goods really are an exemplar that I think the steel industry could learn from, whilst on the surface they might seem very different. And essentially, these four business archetypes, the majority of firms are what we currently see as a laggard, with both low adoption of digital technologies and lower integration with their supply chain partners. But there are some examples of those pathfinders, organisations where they collaborate from different sectors, create new business models, and really have circularity at their core. I don't have time today to go through those. I can provide a web link to a presentation that you could follow up if you want more detail. But what I want to share with you is perhaps what steel can do to actually improve that digital maturity. Now, very recently, as part of Sustain, we did it was a relatively low-key survey, just with a few steel makers within the UK, but it gave us an indicative view that perhaps at the moment, if we look at supply chain digital maturity, the current level of maturity within steel sector is lower than manufacturing generally. However, that 5-year ambition, that ambition to be better, was far, far higher across every single dimension. And that is really, really great. And that's why I suppose we're seeing such great support for projects like Sustain, Circular Metal, the Made Smarter Centre. But what our study also identified, and Zakia, our research fellow, did some great work. She picked up a very common model for looking at technology, which is called the Purdue model, but thought about how this might apply to steel. And I suppose the way you have to think about this, every single one of those processes, these technologies could apply to within that process. And then as we start to think about the internal supply chain, that's about coordinating across all of those processes. And then when we're thinking about the external supply chain, it's thinking about how you might even then integrate further upstream, perhaps beyond that in terms of the mining and where you get your raw materials, and then more upstream in terms of the customers that you're dealing with. But actually, the sorts of things that you need to be thinking about is industrial digital technologies at all of these levels, be they sensing and manipulation at the shop floor. There's similarly the controlling and monitoring that may also take place at the shop floor. The coordination and execution of your manufacturing processes, be they the types of things that you're doing to look at product lifecycle management, whether they're around your manufacturing execution system, whether they're about monitoring and optimization, particularly with relation to maintenance, repair and overhaul. But also you need to think about how you can use the modules that can help you optimize your internal supply chain. How do you bring all of those processes within your organization together? And then more importantly, as I said, how do you then not just optimize your own part of the chain, but perhaps as we do move towards steel as a service, how do you actually gain that end-to-end coordination? And what I would argue is, there are 3 very simple ways that you can begin to improve your IDT or industrial digital technology adoption, because some of the critical barriers that we've seen from our larger survey and the systematic review that we did is that organisations find it quite difficult to integrate technologies. They're put off by the high initial costs, the financial risk, and sometimes the product complexity that this can create. And the 3 ways that we'd encourage your businesses to begin to look at this is, firstly, there's a very old concept. It was developed by Charles Fine, a scholar at MIT, who in the 80s had this idea of clock speed and concurrent engineering. And 3D concurrent engineering is really straightforward. It essentially says that you should design your product, your process, and your supply chain concurrently. Now, what we typically see is that organizations focus on product design first. I think the steel industry is pretty good at process design, but when you're developing your products and your processes, to what extent are you truly thinking about that end-to-end supply chain and actually thinking about how that product is going to be used by your end customers? I suspect not. But actually, we need to take 3D concurrent engineering and actually not just do it for a linear supply chain, but actually to think about it for all of those loops that create the circular economy. The second thing, and actually I haven't done some relatively detailed work with one steel company through an MSc project, looking at how we develop the business case for digital technologies. Quite often this can require a different approach. A lot of steel industry investment cases are very CapEx orientated, they're very payback orientated, and because of the cash constrained nature of the sector, they often really focus on safety or just immediate things that are needed to keep the lights on and to keep the rain out. actually a lot of digital technologies may be using things like software as a service or lease type of models. And so they actually require a shift to more operational OpEx orientated business models. And actually through some of the work we've done through Interact, we've identified that business models, or the inability to know how to write a business model, is one of the biggest barriers to the adoption of new digital technologies, and is something that we'll certainly be looking at, but you can be looking at within your organizations too. And last but not least, you need to create an integrative data backbone, and this could be potentially de-risked by using software as a service, which would reduce the requirement for those capital expenditure in one big lump. And then in terms of how you could improve your supply chain integration, I think for many of your organizations, there's just not that vision of what that end-to-end supply chain is. And also a difficulty in then getting that partnership and collaboration across that chain. But interestingly, internal integration is actually one of the biggest issues, not necessarily joining together the stuff that's actually within your control. Sometimes there can also be some issues with your supplier competence, and there's a lot of concerns around data privacy and security issues. Now, fundamentally, the way in which you view your new product introduction processes and your customer relationship management processes, which quite often have cross-functional teams that are very purpose-driven, that bring together people from both within your internal supply chain and across your external supply chain, should be exactly the same way that you view supply chain. Supply chain management is an end-to-end business process, and actually the way you're going to get that breakthrough in digital readiness or supply chain digital readiness is actually by considering your supply chain as an end-to-end entity. And in order to do that, but to be more future fit, you need to think about how you optimize it, not just for the classic material information and cash, but also for carbon. And actually, we have a really exciting project that we're currently doing with Tata Steel that's called Carbon View. It's an Innovate UK project that's actually looking at how we develop a platform that can do that. And that platform's called Carbon View. And then last but not least, there are a huge amount of trust issues within the steel supply chain. In fact, our previous attempt to do that Innovate UK project fell down because we couldn't get a collaboration agreement set up. And we wonder whether or not some of the ways you may be able to overcome some of these trust issues is to deal with, start thinking carbon, not cash. But I also think there is a risk here too. As a foundation industry, you are where the carbon emissions sit. And what we need to ensure that doesn't happen is that the OEMs that you provide with your steel don't suddenly think, hey, hang on a minute here, all of our carbon or scope 3 emissions lies within the supply chain. Now we're not just going to hammer our suppliers for cost reductions year on year, we're actually going to start hammering them for carbon. I think we need to be having much more intelligent conversations and taking an end-to-end ownership to avoid that situation occurring. So I'd just like to finish by asking you a question and really posing a challenge to you. And I hope you know my very expert changing of the Flourishing World icon to that of the Sustain project. You are part of the Sustain project and many other projects that are, and if you're not part of one of those projects, you have an interest, which is why you're here. We are our choices, as the famous philosopher says, and it's down to us as to which world we create. Thank you.